Okay, we'll move smoothly to a keynote. So I will ask Dean of the Faculty of the Philosophy and Sociology of Warsaw University Department to introduce Professor Wertsch. Professor Krzysztof Koseła.
Dear colleagues, it is one of this present task of Dean. This task is to welcome and to introduce Professor James Wertsch, probably among those numerous jumps over Europe to Moscow. I don't know, it is first or it is not first shorter jump, but we are happy that it happened, you know, that you are with us. We are happy. There are reasons that to be glad to have Professor Wertsch with us. Professor Wertsch is Vice Chancellor for International Affairs and Professor of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the Marshall Snow Professor in Arts and Sciences. He's founding director of the McDonald International Scholars Academy, which is Washington University lead international initiative. Professor Wertsch is author of many publications. You could find in internet discussion on such books as Voices of the Mind, Mind as Action, and the last Voices of Collective Remembering. Approach to problems of memory is probably a bit more psychological than we get used in Europe, because many of us can regard Jan Assmann as our teacher, but for Professor Wertsch, the teacher probably was Vygotsky and Bakhtin, I guess so. Yeah, but it will be for this reason even more interesting just to follow his lecture. Professor Wertsch has great this road through many great universities. He was member of this teaching body at Northwestern University, University of California, San Diego, Clark University, now Washington University in St. Louis. He was also visiting professor of University of Utrecht, of Moscow State University, University of Seville, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Social Sciences, Bristol University, University of Oslo. As you see, the list is very long. Do you remember in great novel of Master and Margareta, there is such episode in Theater Varieté where MC tried to comment what's going on during performance, and this MC was punished. So I will not. I don't want to be punished. So I will just ask Professor Wertsch to present his presentation. Title is Mnemonic Communities and Habits. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the kind invitation to be here. It's my pleasure to be a part of a discussion of people who have thought about many of the issues I struggle with in great depth, and to talk with you about issues of memory, collective memory in this region as well as elsewhere in the world. So I'll be talking about mnemonic habits and communities today, and start out by just giving you a quick set of photos that I think all of you will recognize, and I want to make a point by using these photos here, some big things that happened in, between 1988, in this case, and 1991. I will do this by talking about a chronicle of events. And I will spend part of what I will say, part of the time I'll be talking about how a chronicle of events is turned into a narrative, and the crucial role that narrative and narrative organization plays in our understanding of memory, and perhaps even what we might be able to do about some memories. So here are 8 key events. I have to start out in Poland, of course. This goes before 1989, but some people say this is where it started. Tbilisi, the April 9th tragedy there, 1989. This is a commemoration after that. The Berlin Wall, these photos are probably familiar to you all. Another very famous photo, at least in the United States, in our version of the fall of the wall. Here's Gorbachev arguing with Lithuanians in 1991 about why Lithuania should not become independent, but rather stay part of some kind of confederation or union. Here's a couple days later in Lithuania, the violence at the television towers in Vilnius, where 14 people were killed, I believe. The August 1991 attempted coup, or short-lived coup, depending on your perspective, that went on with figures like Pugo, Yanayev, and Beklanov, the group of 8 leaders who tried to take power away from Gorbachev when he was not in Moscow. Another famous photo here, we have Yeltsin, again in August 1991, standing on the tank, leading the revolution against the Soviet-led regime. And here's one of the last days where you can see the red flag, the Soviet flag over the Kremlin in December of 1991, as the Soviet Union officially was ended a couple weeks later. Okay, so if you just take those events, I've given you 10 pictures there, I think, but you can say there are 8 events that we can list here. And I've just listed them out here in simple form, going from the Gdansk shipyard strike in 1988, up through the official disbanding of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. This is a list of events. They're chronologically ordered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, they come in that time. That's a timeline. This is what we can call a chronicle of the events that went on between 1988 and 1991. Now notice a couple things about this. Every one of these propositions is true, or at least it's accepted as true. And any historian will tell you truth is the best account we have today. It's always open to negotiation, but these are widely accepted propositions. And not only widely accepted, but widely accepted as true. So we say here are 8 accepted or true propositions, at least provisionally, pretty well vetted, but true propositions. Each one has a bunch of evidence that we can use, just the photos for starters, but we can get other evidence if we want to argue about the truth of these, but these are widely accepted as true. And so, in a sense, we have a true account of what happened between 1989 and 1991. If you take this as a set of 8 true propositions, this is an accurate representation of what went on there. Immediately, some of you will say, well, wait a minute, there are other events I think should be up there. That very well may be, but that doesn't question the accuracy of this list, for starters. You could ask, why are these selected? Why aren't a lot of others? Again, the same question. But when you start asking those questions, basically, I would suggest you're asking them because you have a particular narrative. We said nothing about narrative here yet. You have a particular narrative which tells you what events should and should not be included in this list. Okay, so this, again, this is a chronicle. It's just 8 propositions. We could have 800 propositions if you wanted. There's nothing magic about 8. You could have 2 to 50 or whatever. As long as each one of them is true, if we were talking about a scientific theory, we'd say the whole set is true. That text is true because each of the propositions is true. You can say in scientific theory, a theoretical statement is true if and only if every proposition is true, and that's what we have here. But memory and history are not scientific in the sense that they rely on narrativization, narrative, and that's what I want to turn to here. So a chronicle, and I'm using the term here in the form that Hayden White, a philosopher of history, has used it. Chronicle is different from annals. Annals are even more disjointed listings of events, but a chronicle, in a sense, he says at one point, wants to tell a story. And as a matter of fact, it's very hard for any of you to look at that list of 8 events there, the 8 propositions, without knowing what the story, what the overall story is. But a chronicle is not a story, strictly speaking, and part of the reason is because we don't know which story that list of 8 events is telling. You might know in your mind, I might have my opinion, and it's very hard to look at those 8 events without knowing exactly what story it tells, but it doesn't tell the same story to everyone. Okay, so, well, if we say, well, what's this narrativization or narrative organization and add to a chronicle? What makes the list of 8 events a chronicle, and what else would we look for if we say we want to make a narrative out of that? A narrative adds a new level, a new kind of meaning to a chronicle. And whereas we can say each of those 8 propositions is true, there is a sense in which we say this new level of meaning also has a truth value associated with it. When we talk about is a story true or not, we're going to be talking about a different kind of truth than the propositional truth, and that's partly what I'll be talking about here. And you say, what's a true story? What we really mean largely is it's the story, the right story, it's the correct story, but that is a self-centered view. And we have to recognize that limitation that's different from propositional truth. So we're asking, what's the right story? What's the true story of what really happened? If I give you those 8 propositions, well, here's one story. This is the American version. That's the story of the quest for freedom. This is a very deeply seated American idea about what history is about. It's not only from America, of course, but we have our own version of this. So in 1989, Time magazine had a cover story, the big word freedom there, and a picture of the Berlin Wall. That's what it was all about. The story is a plot. It's a story about the quest for freedom of some kind. So that's what you might call the American view. And it might be what a lot of people here, maybe everybody here, thinks it means. But here's another way to plot those same 8 events. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the century. This, of course, comes from Vladimir Putin. He said this in 2005 first, but he continues to say it, and he continues to believe it, as do many people. We don't have to argue about whether he really believes it or he's fooling us or something, but I would say this is a widely shared belief by many people, not only in Russia, I would say, or not only by Putin, but when I travel to China, I can find people in China who will agree that this was a disaster, what happened to the Soviet Union. This is not a freedom, a triumphal story, as we Americans simplistically think, but it's a disaster, you might say. So basically, we have these 8 events, and the issue is, what's the story of those 8 events? What story do those 8 events add up to? There's one answer. There's another answer. And on the one hand, we have what you could call a triumphalist plot, American idea that it's not only American, again, you can find this in Hegel from a lot of people, but the natural tendency of history is to move toward more freedom, to some kind of triumph of freedom over oppression. It's an American Western idea. We already heard a little bit today about the end of history, a very kind of, in my view, ethnocentric and simple version of this you can find in Fukuyama's notion of the end of history. This is the end. There is no further place for history to go because history has reached its end point, the triumph, which was always inherent in it and now had finally arrived in 1989 or 1991 or whenever you think it did. But you could take those same events and say this is a plot. The plot that applies to these same 8 events is a tragedy. It's a downward descent into chaos, disorder, loss of social organization in a way that hurts many, many people. It's a tragic ending. And as all tragedies, had there been, a tragic plot invites us to say, Why didn't somebody stop this earlier? Why didn't somebody prevent this? There was a point when Gorbachev or Brezhnev or somebody could have done something and they missed the opportunity, as in all tragedies. This, again, by the way, is something that is crucial to the way Chinese leadership reads the events of 1989 to 1991. They don't want to start down that slope, and so they examine these events and say, that's a tragedy. There was a way of stopping that tragedy had people had more foresight, more wisdom, been more forceful. So, of course, this tragedy could be the end of, it could be the end of history in a downward slope, or you could say it's just it's a temporary low point in Russian history. It's a kind of ashes that before the reemergence, before the phoenix rises again. That's another kind of cyclical, but again, that's a plot that we're using to make sense of those 8 events. Maybe it's another time of trouble, smutное время, and out of which Russia will reemerge. Okay, so when we have these examples like this, we have 2 completely different ideas about what went on. We agree on the events, we agree on the propositional truth of the events, but we have 2 completely different ideas about, quote, what really happened. These are differences that are not about truth in the sense that they're not about propositional truth. We can agree on the propositions that I gave you, all 8 propositions, no disagreement on that. There's a different kind of truth has to be around. It's not, and when we get into these differences about what really happened, these kind of mnemonic debates over what really happened in the past, I would say these are different from values or opinions. These are different from debates over ideology even. They're not debates about, well, you have one set of values, I have a different, I value society more than you Americans value you Americans value the individual, et cetera. We can agree to disagree with those. In mnemonic debates over what really happened, we get very upset because they say, this is not opinion, it's not values, this is truth. And you're telling me that you don't understand the truth. And when we get to that point, we're in a bad position because we cannot get out of those rhetorical corners. So usually this is not about propositional truth. It's about narrative truth. We end up in these situations saying, look, I'm just telling you what happened. I'm not debating whether you believe something. If you don't know this, I'm just telling you what really happened. The problem is the person on the other side of the table is looking at me and saying, Jim, I'm just telling you what happened. And then we have a problem. We have a problem, so sometimes you end up with situations like under Merkel, somebody who's very wise, it seems to me, very smart, astute, knows Russia, the Soviet Union very well. After Crimea saying, Putin is in a different world. That means I don't have a way of understanding the gulf that separates us in Germany from Russia. Or there was talk in the United States that he's not in touch with reality. That means we don't unless you really think he's kind of clinically crazy or something, it means I don't understand what this other perspective is. We're in what I would call a mnemonic standoff. We have completely different ideas about what went on in the past. And we just at a standoff. It's not just Putin, by the way, of course. You remember that something like 80% recently have been in support of Putin. So this is not just Putin's problem. There's something about mnemonic communities here that is creating this mnemonic standoff. And I want to emphasize here that when we come to one of these situations, these are not about, well, let me start out the other way. When we come to one of these situations, we oftentimes accuse the other people, the people on the other side, well, you just never had access to information. I've had people say, well, you know, in Russia they didn't have access to information, so they don't know what really went on. Today that doesn't work anymore. I think in Russia they've had a lot of access to information. Usually these are not, they do not amount to failure to have information. I had a group of Chinese students tell a group of American students, for example, I was in a seminar with them recently, and we talked about the 1999 bombing of the Belgrade embassy, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And we had about a dozen Washington University students and a dozen Chinese students from Fudan University. And I asked the students, how many of you know what went on in 1999 in Belgrade with the Chinese embassy? All the Chinese students raised their hand. Only 2 of the 12 American students even had heard. They just didn't even know what had happened. And one of the responses of the Chinese students was, well, that's probably because your government controls the media such that you don't know about this. And I said, no, look, if we could get on Google, guys, here in China we cannot get on Google, but if we could get on Google, I can show you anywhere. It's absolutely available information. So usually it's not, we cannot attribute this to failure to know the information, lack of access. Our next thing is we like to say, well, you're just stupid or you're ignorant. You people, you know, you never wanted to know anything and you're stupid. Well, that's not very useful either. Or we sometimes resort to this claim of brainwashing. It's always the other person who's brainwashed. Never would we say, well, I guess I'm brainwashed. Very seldom. Sometimes we do actually, but usually we don't say that of ourselves. Brainwashing is always about the other one. And what we oftentimes say when we come to a mnemonic standoff is, well, you know better, but you cannot admit to saying that your country did such and such, okay? You know what really happened, but it's too painful for you to admit this. That's a kind of conscious, instrumental, rational way of organizing memory that I think is also not what's going on here. I think this is not something that is calculated in that way. So our usual ideas about why somebody has a completely different idea about the past than we do, we oftentimes try to use these explanations or excuses or whatever. They don't work, I would claim, practically in any case. Instead, to get to the basis of this, we have to turn to a kind of a narrative analysis of the way the past is depicted. This is both psychological, but it has to do with mnemonic communities. It has to do with social networks. For me, coming from the perspective, as is noted, special debt to people like Vygotsky, Bakhtin, von Humboldt, for that matter, Spiet, Gustav Gustavovich Spiet. It's not just the individual or social, it's the textual world that we live in, which is both social and individual. But so I'm going to talk about 4 different elements that I think we need in this narrative analysis to try to make sense of how we get into these cases of mnemonic standoffs. First, narrative organization of thought. This is a very old notion. You can find it in Aristotle, who basically, going back to him, talked about poetics, what are the basic elements of narrative, and basically told us that humans are storytelling animals, that what makes us human is that we tell stories. This is as old as Aristotle, if not older. In that sense, narrative cognition, as Jerome Bruner sometimes called it, narrative thinking is natural. You don't have to go to school to learn how to make narratives. You don't have to take advanced calculus. You do have to take calculus in order to understand calculus. It's a formal, reflective, in that sense, not natural way of thinking. Narrative thought is natural, it's ubiquitous. Every society we've ever encountered uses it. Children learn how to tell narratives at early age. But also a narrative is oftentimes done on an automatic, non-conscious level. We immediately jump to conclusions about the real story about something. So in that sense, it's automatic. It qualifies as what Daniel Kahneman, some of you might know his work. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, but wrote basically in psychology. He has a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Narrative is a kind of system 1 thinking for Kahneman. It's automatic, it's routine, it's what he calls lazy. We oftentimes don't like to question narratives. It takes a lot of extra effort to step back and say, wait a minute, where did that just, conclusion come from? Well, it's built into a narrative. And in contrast to critical thinking or scientific thought, narrative thinking goes on so quickly a lot of times and so automatically and so invisibly that we have a hard time realizing that we're actually using narrative organization to make sense of reality, and we're not just looking at reality itself. A very important comment by one of my mentors from the Soviet time was Alexander Romanich Luria had a notion about ways in which language, and in this case narrative, can be transparent. We use narratives as if they're clear windows. And you look right through them. It's more like a prism. You think you're looking that way, but you're really seeing something over here, and you don't know that the prism is shaping what you see. That's the way narratives work. They're transparent to our, and that's partly what we're here today to try to do, is to make them less transparent. A word about narrative organization. Here I borrow from semioticician Paul Ricoeur. Talk about this is very simple in a lot of ways, but we need to highlight these things to keep them in mind, I think. There are two dimensions that you can talk about of narrative organization. One is just temporal organization. Narratives deal with events that come one after another. In that sense, narrative representation is different from mathematical representation. In arithmetic, 2 plus 3 equals 5 is exactly the same as 3 plus 2 equals 5. There's no sense in which 3 or 2 or 5 comes first or before or after. In narrative organization, we're always talking about temporal sequence of events. Secondly, the second thing that makes it uniquely narrative, though, that takes us beyond Chronicle, is that it has a plot. There's an emplotment, a drawing together into a coherent whole of these events. A plot grafts together into the events into one story. Okay? So Aristotle started us on this by saying a narrative has a beginning, middle, and end. It sounds very simple and banal, but actually it means narrative beginning. And once upon a time there was a narrative middle and a narrative ending. The sense of an ending is particularly crucial to narrative organization. The end tells us what basically the moral of the story is. By plotting something with a particular end, we're giving a particular evaluation. It has a moral and a moralizing impulse in the way we tell a narrative. So, for example, we just saw there are two different narrative emplotments of the list of 8 events I gave you. One's triumphalist. It's as if, you know, a very smug American would tell you at the end. And so it shows that people actually always are in the quest for freedom, and they reached it. They finally reached it in 1991. That's end of story. Or there's a tragic ending. Completely, it's a different ending, and it gives you a different reading then of all the events that happened before. It's not just an ending to the same events, it recasts, it reinterprets those events. If you know you're headed toward a tragic ending, if you're watching a good tragedy, you watch every event and you say, why can't you stop now? Don't you see where you're going? But you only do that because you know the tragic ending that you're headed toward. Okay, so the sense of an ending is crucial for this kind of narrative organization. Then we go back to this issue. So what's the true plot? What's the real plot? How do we decide between these two ways of emplotting 1989 and 1991? Why does one go one way and one the other? And why do entire communities, mnemonic communities, emplot things in one way, in a very strong tendency, as opposed to another? I can give you another example because I've spent more time with Chinese colleagues recently, but if I ask Chinese young people, people my age or older even, professionals, students, faculty, what happened in 1999, the bombing of the Belgrade, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade? It's almost as if I can be pretty sure that 1.3 billion Chinese will tell me that was no accident. That was an intentional act on the part of the United States. It was an attempt to humiliate China to remind us who was boss. Going back to my country, I can ask almost all 300 million Americans that all say that was really stupid, it was inexcusable, but it was an accident. Why would we do, there's no point in our doing. How can you have two communities that seem to have completely different memories that seem to line up? And is it because of schools? It's very hard to say this unless we go to a level deeper, which is what my next point here is about the need for underlying codes and analysis of underlying codes and underlying habits. Habits get us close to institutions, but codes are the semiotic, the Vygotskian, Bakhtinian side of things for me. But if we ask, well, how do we know which of those stories is the right one? Okay, I would say we make those decisions on the basis of the underlying codes that we come to the storytelling enterprise with as members of mnemonic communities. So the decisions on the narrative truth, is it a triumph or tragedy, 1989 and 1991? How do you decide which of those is right, quote, true? This is sometimes what people call cultural DNA. Putin and Russians have a different cultural DNA than Americans. Well, what's that mean? It's actually a dangerous term, DNA here, but it catches something that's useful. I would say what that's different here is the underlying narrative templates that characterize the two mnemonic communities, the Russian and the American one in this case. Narrative templates, and I'll go into detail here, but as with all cultural tools from a Vygotskian perspective, for any cultural tools empower us in certain ways. They're extremely effective at organizing information, but they also constrain us in certain ways. What you see is a great benefit by using a cultural tool, but that same cultural tool will make pretty certain that it's very hard to see other things. So at both what sometimes we say a cultural tool, a cultural narrative has both, or a narrative tool, if you will. A narrative tool has both affordances that afford certain possibilities and constraints. Okay, so the two levels of narrative analysis that I would distinguish, and this gets us, you could go down many more levels, but there's basic distinction here between what I call specific narratives on the one hand. Specific narratives include information about concrete settings, times, places, and characters, okay? They're the surface form that you actually can see or read or hear. Okay, so for example, if you just wrote out 1989, the Soviet system began to unravel, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was followed by Gorbachev's fate, et cetera. It has places, dates, actors. This is a specific narrative. It may be true or not, it might be partial, but all I'm saying is a specific narrative because it names concrete actors, places, times. A narrative template, on the other hand, is something that we do not see, but we have to posit. That's what the analysis here is about. It's a kind of underlying form, or deep structure, if you will, but it's just underlying form that we must posit in order to make sense of a lot of the patterns we see in specific narratives. So it's something that investigators have to propose, and it's then open to criticism about whether it's the right one, whether evidence supports its existence, whether it serves as a useful theoretical entity. But it's a generalized story pattern. It's abstract, schematic. It doesn't name specific dates or actors or places. It's a general story pattern. And it's this that provides the narrative habits of a mnemonic community. It's this what a mnemonic community might forget many of the specific dates or characters or events, but it brings a pattern of telling a story to events that it encounters or events that it remembers. And so it's the narrative habits of a mnemonic community derived from this narrative template. So here's an example. This is one that I've proposed some time ago, and I have variations on this one, but here is an example from Russia. The claim here is that this is a narrative template. There's an expulsion of alien invaders or alien enemies narrative template that guides a lot of the understanding of the Russian mnemonic community when taking particular events. Taking particular events in Ukraine right now. NATO is trying to invade Russia once again, okay? Well, so this is what I would posit then as a narrative template that underlies the Russian mnemonic community's interpretation and makes it so puzzling to Americans and a lot of Western Europeans as well about why could they think such a thing. They're thinking because they're governed by this narrative template that goes something like this. Russia is peaceful, not bothering anybody else. Trouble comes in the form of some external invasion, oftentimes very vicious but wanton, without provocation. Some kind of invasion, some kind of threat to Russia comes from outside. Russia nearly loses everything in total defeat. It suffers from the enemy's attempts to destroy it as a civilization. And through heroism and exceptionalism, acting alone, Russia triumphs, okay? So this is what I would posit. This is not only something that belongs to Russia, but it is something that Russians use as a habit of thinking, as a narrative template, as a kind of mnemonic habit, if you will, when looking at a lot of events. And so, for example, they can list a lot of these, and some people would say, well, wait a minute, that's just accurate. I mean, that did happen. It happened with the Mongols, the Germans, I'm talking about the 13th century Germans, Poles, Swedes, French, Germans, NATO. Actually, Russians used this to make sense of capitalism, or Marxism, for that matter. Marxism is a Western ideology. It came from Western thought was an attempt to destroy Russian civilization, not through tanks, but through ideology, et cetera. But basically, you have multiple specific narratives with the same general plot of this expulsion of alien invaders, alien enemies coming in. When somebody says, but this just reflects reality, I know there are people in this room that say, no, that doesn't reflect reality. There are other plots that you can use to understand what Russia did. I mean, how did it get so big, first of all? I mean, how did Georgia become part of the Russian Empire, or Azerbaijan, or Ukraine for that matter, okay? These are not something, that's not something that you can understand only from that one narrative template. So it's a Russian narrative template, but it's not the only one that you can use to make sense of historical events. I want to turn just for a second here, this is almost a digression, but it's crucial that we say, well, where do these narrative templates come from? If there are 1.3 billion Chinese that differ from 300 million Americans, is that just some kind of extremely powerful government plot, or where does it come from? No, I think here's where we have to turn to the brilliance of people like Koseła, Vygotsky, Bakhtin, to say, from this perspective, we're saying that humans are basically narrative-using or tool-using animals. The human action is mediated by the use of tools, including language, including narratives. So you could say humans are symbol-using animals, tool-using, whatever. And from this perspective then, remembering is on the individual, but on a collective level, always mediated action. It always involves agents using cultural tools, narrative tools in particular. In this sense, I think some of the distinction that you've been talking about, I thought about a little bit, given the title of this conference about the difference between collective and collected memory, for example. In this sense, individuals are using these cultural tools. Even when you collect their individual memories together, you're actually collecting them, if they belong to one community, using a same cultural tool. In that sense, there's a continuity. They speak as individuals, as members of a mnemonic community. The reason they're members of a mnemonic community is because they use the same cultural tools and from this perspective. So you can Bakhtin comes close to saying that many times language almost does narratives, but narrative in the framework here, narratives do some of our speaking and thinking and remembering for us. Now, I don't want to push this too far, because I think humans are agents. There must be human responsibility. It's not something you can say, well, this bad story made me do the bad thing that Americans did. It wasn't me personally, but it's just what the bad story made me do it. No, we don't want to go down that kind of, I'm oversimplifying it, but go down a kind of instrumentalist reductionism here, or what could be viewed as a postmodernist kind of claim. We have to leave room here for active, responsible agents, but agents cannot act independently of cultural tools. So this is the basic unit of analysis that we start out with from this perspective. And again, these narrative tools that we use have a very big impact on us, but we don't even know that they're there many times. They're transparent. And that's part of the veiled power that they have. The power is there, but part of its very power comes from the fact that these narratives remain veiled. It's as if you look at a videotape and anybody has to see what went on. But the problem is different people see different things because they don't realize they're using different veiled narrative tools. Koseła had this great term, the curse of immediacy. He's saying, on the one hand, there's no way that we can function without using symbols to make sense of the world. On the other hand, as soon as we use symbols, we drag things into our thinking and remembering and acting that we don't like. Even that we deny sometimes. So the curse of immediacy is this double-sided. Narratives always empower, always afford certain possibilities, and always constrain. And once you become a member of a community that is defined by the habits of the narrative tools you use, you're going to see the world in a different way than people from another community do. Okay? So it also, this notion of mediation reminds us that cultural tools, in this case narratives, they don't just come from someplace out of the sky. They are not individually invented. I might think that I'm going to tell you a story now about what really happened in World War II. This is my story. You say, well, where'd you get this? Anybody would know. It comes from all kinds of other people. Very, very seldom do we invent fully a narrative, even of ourselves, I would claim. We use off-the-shelf technology, the existing narrative tools. So in that sense, you can think of narrative tools from the perspective of being produced. Every nation state in the world spends huge amounts of resources to produce national narratives, okay? Because these are not just about historical truth, but they're also narrative tools for forming good citizens of particular nations. So of course, nation states, all kinds of large-scale institutions are involved in producing the narratives that we use as cultural tools, but they are consumed as well. And I think if anything, we overemphasize the power of the state to control national memory. In many ways, the state has to come up with national narratives that will find traction, that will be accepted by citizens of that state, of that nation. In that sense, it will be consumed. And the process of consuming, as somebody like Michel Desserteau talked about, consuming can be a form of production itself. Namely, if tomorrow in the United States, people tried it for decades in the United States to have a communist party. We technically, when I lived in the Soviet Union, I could honestly say we do have a communist party. They can run for president. And a guy named Gus Hall ran for president again and again. So it wasn't that the state said, you're under arrest. I mean, we did that in other ways, but not with the Communist Party in this sense. But the Communist Party never got traction in the United States. And the reason is the textual means it had would not be consumed by American cultural community. That's my perspective anyway, but the point is not about America, but the point is they have to find a ready consumption, a resonance with an audience. Another example, in America, I would say we have a national narrative in a very shorthand term, something that has to do with, that comes from 1620, the idea that we're a city upon a hill. America is an example unto humans about how to live, how to create a great civilization. It comes from 1620 sermon by John Winthrop for the Puritans. But we use this term actually, and we continue to use it today. We talk about a city upon a hill. We talk about a beacon of humankind. So you could say, well, that might be George W. Bush, but no, Abraham Lincoln used this. Franklin Delano Roosevelt used it. Ronald Reagan used it. He ended his last speech as the president talking about he still believes in a city upon a hill. To be sure, George W. Bush used it, but Barack Obama talks about the beacon of liberty. Why do presidents talk about this? And it strikes many people from other societies as strange, if not bizarre, but why do presidents use this? Because they know it appeals, it will be consumed by the American public in a way that does make sense, for better or worse, it does make sense to American mnemonic community. That's the defining story of America from this perspective, and hence, presidents who are very smart about appealing rhetorically use this again and again. So there's, in the case of narrative tools, then they're produced and they're consumed. But again, it's not just a matter of state control. Okay, so now constraints. I want to talk for a minute about constraints of all narrative tools and narrative templates here. Using an idea of a German-American philosopher, theologian, the greatest American public theologian of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, talked about egoism. For him, as a Christian theologian, this is the primal sin. You don't have to talk about sin to believe this, but the point here is that egoism is a fundamental property that we as humans share, and it shows up in our use of narrative templates as well. So all national narrative templates have some element of egoism built into them. They tell the story from their perspective, and this can be very strong in certain ways. And there's a phenomenon that's recently been studied in social psychology called my-side bias, which has to do with, there have been thousands of experiments done now where people show that you can show how well we can pick out several arguments for a case and several arguments against a case And basically, the more arguments that you can pick out, that you can develop in order to support a case, it correlates with intelligence. More intelligent people are more capable of identifying and generating multiple arguments about a particular point of view. That's true about when you're arguing for arguments that support your perspective. When you look at, try to get people to generate arguments that do not support your perspective, what you find out, there are some people who are good at this and some people who are not, but it's not correlated with intelligence. The point here is that my side bias, or egoism, is not a matter of intelligence. There are very few things that we know of in psychology and psychological abilities that are not in some way correlated with intelligence, including trauma, for example, susceptibility to trauma. But when it comes to understanding and being good at understanding other perspectives that disagree with your own, when it becomes a matter of overcoming my side bias, people who are more intelligent are no better at this than others, okay? They can be good at it, but it's not a function of intelligence. So the point is, my side bias is built into practically all national narratives, and my side bias is not something that you necessarily can overcome just by saying we need to get the smartest people in the room to talk about this. Let me then talk about a little bit what we might do about the antidotes, because so far I've given you a lot of reasons to be very depressed about what national narratives do. We're trapped in them and there's nothing much we can do to get out of them. No, I think that's, to me, it's really interesting and important as I listen to the talks here and as I've read some of your works elsewhere, that we think about, okay, so what is there that we have if we think memory not only is useful but oftentimes dangerous? What tools do we have at our disposal? Where can we find mechanisms or ideas that allow us to not fall prey, to fall into the trap of being a mindless member of a mnemonic community? In some ways, I don't have anything much new to offer here, but building on some of the ideas I've had so far, the first point I would make is I think it's important to distinguish, it's difficult and partial, but also necessary and ethically crucial to distinguish between memory and history the best way we can. Both of them use narratives, so I'm not saying memory is narrative and history. No, not at all. But historical analysis, though, as opposed to memory, can be a kind of, that's what we ask professional historians to do many times. Give us a more objective account that we at least have a beginning of a discussion. Maybe I'll disagree with you, but at least start us in that road. Remember, when I said use of narratives in these narrative, especially narrative templates, that's automatic, it's a type 1 thinking, it's a system 1 thinking. We need system 2 thinking, that is rational, reflective, something that slows us down, gets us to reflect a little bit more, and that's basically what you could say history is about compared to memory. So here's a few comparative terms you could list. For example, memory tends to reflect a single committed perspective. History, at least it tries to distance itself from any single perspective. It aspires to objectivity. Any historian can tell you there's no such thing as a perfectly objective history, but the aspiration is to be objective, to consider alternatives, to distance yourself from any single perspective. Memory clearly belongs to community. History aspires to be independent of community, to be the reflection of the community of analytic historians, if anything. System 1, System 2, unreflective, non-conscious in the case of memory, critical, self-reflective stance in the case of history. Memory tends to be very impatient with ambiguity, especially moral ambiguity. Another case, one of the first places I ran across some of these ideas where I found myself in these positions was in discussions I had with friends, very good friends who were very pro-American, more pro-American than I was probably, who lived in the Soviet Union in the 70s. And sometimes I have discussions with them and have to explain, no, America does have problems. We have very big, no, Jim, it's just so great there. We went on, but one of the places where I ran into a fundamental difference in what really happened was over the uses of America's use of atomic bombs in 1945 in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Any American knows, certainly in my generation, a little bit younger, basically it's just true for Americans that we used atomic bombs in Japan in order to stop the war, and that succeeded. It stopped the war. There's actually good historical evidence that there was reasons that Americans had, including Truman and Secretary of War at the time, that the Japanese were going to stop fighting anyway. And so there's some question, at least among American historians, but not in American memory, about why we used atomic bombs in World War II. My Russian friend, who was so pro-American, looked at me when I said this. He said, "You can't really believe that. Anybody knows that the reason Americans used the bomb in 1945 was to intimidate Stalin and the Soviet Union, to stop them from encroaching further in Asia or in Europe." I said, "Well, no, Vici, that's not..." But the more I looked into it, actually, there's evidence that that was the case. But here again, you find two communities with completely different ideas. I had very little, I was impatient with moral ambiguity in that case. I might have said, well, maybe there was some evidence for that, but I just ruled that out because that's just not true, Vitya, talking to my Russian friend. To this day, many people in many places of the world say it's obvious why America used atomic bombs. It had nothing to do with stopping the Japanese and ending the war. This is, in America, basically you find so much impatience with ambiguity over this point that people will get offended if you say, you know, actually, maybe America used the bomb in 1945 in order to intimidate the Soviet Union. That's not just wrong, that's offensive. You could get from people, at least my parents' generation. So here you see the kind of thing we have, that we not only say, well, no, we're not likely to say, I guess that's an interesting alternative perspective or something. You say, no, that's just, where did you get that? You got to be crazy if you think that. That's just wrong. And furthermore, it offends me when you say things like that. Well, we're at a mnemonic, we're really at a mnemonic impasse there, a mnemonic gulf that we can't get over. Memory tends to celebrate its presentist orientation. In this case, collective memory is around because it does something for us right in the present. We need it in order to justify arguments or whatever. History tends to view events as then and there. Memory tends to have a strongly mythic element to it. History aspires anyway to keeping its rational, reflective orientation in view. Many of these things come straight out of somebody like Halbach's or others, so there's in some ways nothing new here. But my point here, well, as a summary with regard to narrative, my point would be, if you put everything in a nutshell, like we like to do in sound bites in America, some simple thing, you say, in the case of memory, there's a tendency to preserve an existing narrative at the expense of evidence. So, talking to my friend Vitya, I don't want to hear about some little memo that Truman got about, or some little letter that Truman wrote to his wife about why maybe they wanted to scare Uncle Joe, as he put it. So that's, I'm going to keep the existing narrative and discard that evidence if I have to. In contrast, the way you make your career, at least in America as a professional historian, is you take an existing narrative that ideally some mentor of yours had, and as we say in the Freudian sense, you kill the father. You take that narrative, you say, you know that narrative that my mentor developed, I'm going to give you a bunch of new pieces of evidence, new archives, and show the whole narrative's wrong. That whole thing goes out. Well, ideally, in the kind of historical argument, if there's a strong argument, you can use evidence, you can preserve evidence at the expense of an existing narrative. Okay? So takeaway net messages, just a couple of last slides here. One, I think it's very useful to have these two levels of analysis because it'll give us a way of understanding where we get our narrative truth claims from. It's very hard to understand this if we don't have some underlying account of narrative templates. So we need, in my view, we need to have this distinction to understand where mnemonic standoffs come from, why they're so intractable, so difficult, and what we might do about them, namely distinguish between specific narratives and narrative templates. And secondly, we have to recognize these narrative templates are extremely powerful, in part because they're non-conscious, transparent, veiled in their work that they do, and we don't even realize that we're using them. They're doing some of our speaking for us. They're resistant to change. One of the major reasons I came to conclude that I needed to find this Russian narrative template, expulsion of alien enemies, was I was looking at Soviet and post-Soviet Russian history textbooks. And there were radical changes between, say, 1965 or 1975 and 2000. Things that were written in textbooks in 1990 could put you in jail in 1970, no question. But the basic story was, it was the same story with different characters. Instead of the Communist Party being the great hero, it was now the great Russian people. But it was still expulsion of alien enemies as the basic narrative line. So the point here is, these are resistant to change. Even when we say there's a completely new political system in effect now, things that would put you in jail or worse 30 years ago, now you're paid to write this down. In one sense, you're writing exactly the same thing down at the narrative template level. In another sense, of course, it is different at a specific level. And we need to understand the way in which these narrative templates have built into them this my side bias. And the antidotes we have to rely on reflective analytic history. We have to provide institutionalized means for being able to step back and say, I know you believe that, but let's look at the evidence and see if there's counter evidence that you need to explain, and that's what historians are good at. And then we also need to develop a level of self-reflection and what Reinhold Niebuhr's basic message, a level of humility, being humble about the truths and the narrative templates that give us those truths that we all hold so dear. So we need to be self-reflective and to develop a degree of humility about the constraints of the narrative templates that we have. First, we have to see what they are, and secondly, we have to be willing to say, it's possible that I could see a different way of imploding those events that I saw in just one way until 5 minutes ago when you confronted me. So let me stop with that, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk to this group. It's a great opportunity and a privilege for me to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
So probably somebody would want to ask questions or comment the presentation of Professor Wertsch. So yeah, sit down, and we have Professor Szacka. Mm-hmm.
I only want to say thank you, not only for this what we hear just now, but only for your book, which I quoted many times in my publications. And now I see in this last part that it is a new version of this, what is on this 44 page in your book. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. So who would want to ask a question or comment? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Jeff Olick. Thanks for this very clear presentation, very inspiring, and but I want to disagree with part of it. First of all, that I'm much less optimistic than you are about the ability of historians to help us overcome this bias, especially given the long history of historians' involvement in nationalism and the like. I'm sure you're aware of that. But I was thinking, the case I was thinking of, and I couldn't decide whether it was a question of different narrative templates or a question of values, was in the first campaign for president when Barack Obama was criticized a great deal because he was trying so hard to overcome narrative bias. Right, he was considered wishy-washy, where on the one hand you had Bush, who sees everything clearly, black and white, and you have Obama, the deliberator, the decider versus the deliberator. Is that a question of a different narrative template or a different set of values about the multiplicity of values?
It's a good question. I think it's, among other things, it's a question about complexity of thinking. I mean, without trying to make too much of a political comment here, Obama is oftentimes faulted today. When people say he still thinks he's a professor of constitutional law, and he doesn't make clear decisions. So in a sense, you could say it's a use of complexity when reflecting on our first instincts that you see in Obama, and that's not necessarily effective as a political voice. I would say, furthermore, that Obama himself very effectively used the American city upon a hill narrative as part of his campaign. He said, we did have racism. America's shame is to have had racism. But I would not be here, only in America could I be here today. That is, the story of America is one that, yes, we had problems, we had racism, we did genocide, we carried out genocide against Native Americans, we had Jim Crow discrimination, we continue to have racism to some degree, we had the civil rights, but his point was it's precisely by looking at how we've overcome these things that we can celebrate, and I can help you celebrate, once again, the thing that we all share, our national narrative template. So basically, you're asking, I think, a question about how single or simple-mindedly do you use a narrative template, and how much do you open it up to question. And his job before as a constitutional lawyer meant he was an expert at doing this, but right now it's not serving him very well at all as an American political figure.
Introduce yourself.
Adam Mielczarek, Uniwersytet Jagielloński.
Adam Mielczarek, Jagiellonian University, Institute of Sociology.
Question about continuity and change. Your theory stress the continuity. What about the change of templates? In Poland, in August 1980, it happened that a large part of population changed the way they narrated Polish history, the general political situation. How would you explain that change in the framework of your theory?
Now, I mean, this is a big question, and to some degree, I've become more convinced than I anticipated in the continuity of these. I see it's very difficult to change these at the level of narrative templates. To be sure, specific narratives are changed all the time and drastically. I don't know the case of Poland very well, so I can't comment, but I would say in Europe, and maybe in the world, the one place that I've seen more massive effort over decades that constitutes an attempt to change the narrative template is in Germany. No place else in the world, including America, Russia, Japan, China, anywhere else, do you find people saying, you know, the fundamental story of our nation we had before 1945, that's not only wrong, but it was terribly wrong. And now, I don't know if it has succeeded, that's for time to tell in Germany, but no place has there been an effort that's gone on for 7 decades to say, we need to fundamentally change our narrative template. That's exactly what China and Japan are arguing over right now in East Asia. If you can win a war or lose a war and still not change your narrative template. And in the end, I have to admit, it's a mystery to me why these are so resistant to change. And I think we need to take individual case studies to examine it, to try to figure out. But I've been very struck by how little, at this deep level, things do change in most cases.
All right, Yannis Panayotilis, University of Osnabrück. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the relation between experience and your narrative templates, and which templates resonate with people. Taking the Russian example that you dwelled on quite a bit, the foreign invasion scenario, well, you can sort of take this as a somewhat abstract narrative template with exchangeable roles, but there remains the fact that within living memory there was a massive invasion and millions of people killed by foreign invaders. So perhaps you could say a bit more about how these templates come to resonate in relation to actual experience rather than just, well, narrative. Thank you.
Well, very good question. If I wanted to get picky, the first thing I would say is, what is actual experience if it's not narrativized? But that doesn't answer your question really, I think. To be sure, I don't question for a second that Russia and Russians have suffered tremendously through invasions. And they were heroic in many ways. I mean, it's a good thing for American, a lot of Americans think America won World War II, but it's craziness, of course. Russians were heroic. They did massive things that defeated Germany in World War II, no question. It's when, for example, though, the same basic storyline is used to talk in the end about what Marx really was, or when they talk about capitalism, that you have a problem. And furthermore, I would say it's not just, it's not like there's one narrative template per nation, and that's the only thing. I think because, and I'm still struggling with this one, but I think this is part of it's related to, but somewhat distinct from another narrative that will partly answer your question here, I think. Namely, there's another narrative template for Russia that has to do with its historical mission for humankind. And right now, the debates in Russia, the kind of theoretical debates with people like Alexander Dugin, but getting listened to by Putin about Eurasianism, neo-Eurasianism. Eurasianism being a central civilization that actually puts Europe on the periphery and celebrates the Mongol invasion because this is the origin of a Eurasian civilization which has missions in the world. That's it's a related narrative, but it's one that also suggests that Ukraine obviously has been and must remain part of the neo-Eurasian civilization. This is a term we don't know much about in the West. I have my colleague here, Ralph Garagosov, to thank for helping me understand it. But neo-Eurasianism, neo-Eurasianism has been around since the 20s, kind of got re-imported back from Western Europe into Russia. But Putin himself uses these terms and uses some of the ideas that some of the leading thinkers, whatever you think of them, of neo-Eurasianism are saying today. And in this view, it's not just being invaded, but a messianic mission for expanding the civilization to its true borders. So it's related, but it's another narrative which it's harder to say what's the historical evidence of the role of experience in creating this, but it does play a role, and it does play a role in creating the experience of people in places like Ukraine right now. So.
I will have a question. I have problem with this narrative templates, and it is, I would say, methodological. There was problem of limits, always, and very inconvenient problem of limits. At conference in Szczecin, there was quite big team of Russian teachers, and some of them respectable. And when we commented what was going on in Russia, one of them told that the West is always unhappy when there is real progress in Russia, and the West will always do something just to undermine this progress. So I don't know how popular is this opinion among Russians. Probably if it is such popular as this always invaded Asia, so I would say yes, it is narrative templates. But if it is only one opinion of person who is really looking for patterns, looking for regularities, so how we should regard this? What should be our approach to such opinion? It is narrative templates which should be discovered and ashamed or not. You know, it is my problem.
Be discovered and what?
To say that it is a stupid opinion.
Oh. Well, it might be a stupid opinion, but all of us are stupid then, because we all function, I think, to a large degree with these. But your formulation there might answer some of the previous questions as well. You know, if you think the basic story of Russia is one of we are always trying to reach progress to get just a basic and improved level of civilization, then somebody invades us or somehow interferes. That puts together potentially this idea of the mission of neo-Eurasianism with the threats it poses and the reasons you get these external invasions as well. I think, it's a very good question, because the notion of narrative template is one that came out of a particular empirical enterprise, namely my trying to deal with how can I understand Soviet to post-Soviet Russian historical discourse, mnemonic discourse in history textbooks. History textbooks everywhere, a mix of history and memory textbooks, I'd say. But it is something that, in a sense, has the same problem that culture has. Nobody can live without culture. There are many different cultures, but when you try to define it, it gets to be very, very difficult. And notice I only contrast it with specific narratives. I don't, beyond a point, try to define it. There are a lot of different places where you can find elements of this kind of thinking in Hallbox. You can find it in Frederick Bartlett, origin, but all over memory studies and psychology today. There's this idea that memory always involves, as Bartlett put it, an effort toward meaning. But my point is, it's not just an effort toward meaning that you have as a personal agenda, but it's an effort toward meaning with the help of your narrative tools that you don't even know are sitting next to you speaking. And so, in that sense, it does reflect bias, locality, cultural boundedness, and danger in many cases. But on the other hand, the problem with these narrative templates and the way they manifest themselves in mnemonic standoffs, we think nobody else is speaking except the truth. And when we start arguing about truth, about what really happened, that's when we get to be really very dangerous, I think. And we need a way of us backing away from that.
Panie profesorze, chciałbym zadać Polish.
Professor, the question is, I'm going to refer to one of the first questions that were perhaps not academic enough, because you said that the historians help us to organize and to find ourselves within the narrations, within the narrative patterns in which we are immersed, but also at the same time we know that the historians create or co-create these narrations. So how do you differentiate historians, both group of the historians?
Anybody familiar with history and the politics, the culture of history knows it's very difficult to separate memory from history. As I said, I think it's not only, it is difficult, but I think it's possible to some degree, and I think it's absolutely essential, ethically essential to do so, no matter how hard it is. But I also know, for example, there's a wonderful book, maybe 15 years old now, called Telling the Truth About History. It's written by 3 American women historians. And they trace American history as it was written across decades. And one of the things that they can document is, long time American history had everything to do with what we call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. They were the actors in history. There wasn't anybody else in history. Then, 20th century, we started having some Jews come into the history profession. And suddenly, American history had to have a part of it. Suddenly, it had to have a part that would have to do with immigrants, the Jewish immigration. Then we had African Americans become professional historians. And now we have African American experience. Maybe it's the biggest experience to define American history. And then women. And suddenly women are there too. So the point is, they said, in what sense is this objective history at any point? But the alternative, I would say, is the fact that they wrote that book and reflected on the history of history telling is exactly what we still tend not to do in memory studies. So yes, history aspires to objectivity. I mean, anybody who knows anything about history knows that it's a hope, it's an aspiration, it's never very well done. And it's possible to read history from other societies. Even in America, even when the British read our history of what happened in the 18th century, they say, I can't believe you really think that was a revolution. That was just a misunderstanding, what you call the American Revolution. So even countries that are fairly close together are surprised at this. But that's precisely why I think you need to have meetings like this, especially in the area of memory, where you have a chance to say, okay, over a drink or over a seminar, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to listen, and I'm going to tell you why your memory is wrong, but I'm going to have to argue with you on serious grounds and not just pull my flag out and put it here and say you're out of. So it's a call for dialogue and rationality. In that sense, it's not much different from Adorno or Habermas or many other people, but it's the best we have. And the biggest problem we have with memory, again, many times, we think we're talking about truth and not about difference of ideology or opinion. We're talking about truth, and that's what gets very offensive. So yeah, I know historians are not perfect by far.
Hi, my name is Tomohiro Usuda from Norwich University of the Arts, and my theme is about narratives in Berlin after the unification. I have two questions I'd like to ask you. One, you've mentioned the German attempt to change the sort of narrative frameworks over the last 70 years. I'd like to hear your views in particular about their attempts after '89, following the fall of the wall. And second question is that the connection or relation between narrative templates and individual views or individual narrative. So, for example, I'm from Japan, and you've mentioned the Japanese and the Chinese conflict of views. But I don't feel that I fit into a particular template, if you like. So I may have views similar to the narrative pattern in Japan, and sometimes it might be to do with the Chinese pattern. So if you could explain a little bit about the individual memories in relation to the narrative templates. Thank you.
Okay, with regard to Germany, I kind of only know what people like in this audience tell me, are reading Ian Baruma's book called The Wages of Guilt, I think it's called, where he compared, it's a popular author in America who is Dutch, but is married to a woman from Japan, so he speaks Dutch, German, Japanese, and he writes in English. He did a book called The Wages of Guilt, where he started out as a German, kind of as a Dutch person, kind of knowing who really the bad guys were in World War II. And then he went to Japan to look at how they talked about World War II. And in spite of himself, it's a personal odyssey of Ian Baruma in a lot of ways. He came to the conclusion, you know, the Germans have done a way better job than the Japanese at refining or transforming the way they talk about what happened in World War II and what that tells them about their country today. And it's not just better than Japan, but like I say, virtually no nation, in my view, has done so much work. If it's successful for the long-term future, that's what we'll find out, but it seems to have made a very big difference in German society to me. But again, that's for people who are from Germany or who are in Germanistics to really tell us more about. With regard to, if I understand your question about the individual and narrative template, the notion of narrative template is one that applies not just to nations. I mean, I talked about national narrative templates, but it's basically, these narrative tools are around us for all kinds of purposes, including to tell our own life story, for example. In America, especially, we have this idea that I can tell any story, I can be anything I want to be. That's what it means to have this freedom. And this is very naive for a lot of people find in the rest of the world. But even when we tell a story about, I've never found myself until I got to be 22 and such and such happened or something. I found my own story. We talk about this way all the time. But if you're not American, first of all, you hear this say, that's a typical American story. You can tell. They don't know it, but they're just using a storyline that everybody else uses. But these also change. For example, today in America, it's entirely possible, just like the CEO of Apple just did last week, to come out and be proudly gay. That could be your life story. 100 years ago, that story was not available as a cultural tool. It's not that we didn't have gay people, but there was no cultural tool to use in a powerful way to make sense of yourself, and basically available at all to make sense of yourself. My great-grandmother, I never knew her, but maybe she wanted to be divorced. But the idea of a woman being divorced in 19th century America, legally it was possible, but there's no off-the-shelf technology to make sense of it. So in that sense, it applies all the way down to individual level. Now, if I got your question, though, I think partly you're saying, what about people who are members of more than one mnemonic community? And here again, I guess to date, just anecdotally, I've been impressed by continuity rather than change. I'll give you an example of this. I gave a talk about this kind of thing, about the Hiroshima-Nagasaki issue, to a group of comparative literature philosophers, scholars, philosophers, and others in New Haven about 15 years ago. And these are very sophisticated people. They're comparative literature, after all. They represent all these different societies, know the literatures, and are very expert and open, not egocentric or ethnocentric. When I asked the group there, so why do you think that America used the 2 atomic bombs in 1945 to stop the war? How many of you think that? Everybody raised their hand except for 2 people. The 2 who didn't were 2 young people who were Soviet Russian emigres. They did not like the Soviet Union. They were there in America because they wanted to get away from there. And they were even, if anything, overly pro-American in certain ways. But for them, it was still a truth that, no, obviously, use it for... Now, do they think the same thing today? I don't know. But I think one of the things, and this comes from a lot of sociology of collective memory studies that some of our colleagues do, what happens to you during the critical period, say somewhere between the ages of 15 and 25, the kind of narrative template that you develop in making sense of things at that point, I think is very, very hard to change in terms of lifespan. So that critical period is something that there's a lot of evidence that your political views, your view about what really happened, and the tools you use, or the narrative template you use to make sense of what really happened, you have to have tremendous reflective capacity to get beyond that once that gets locked into place.
So problem will be just to identify this crucial period.
Yeah. No, it probably has everything to do with identity and identity formation in that period of life.
My name is Małgorzata Pakier. I wanted to refer again to this question about change and continuity. And you gave the example of Germany that changed the template of the narratives. It seems to me that this change was a new narrative template in itself, right? So to make a thick line under the past and to create, I don't know, new German society. So do you agree with that? And then I would think that there was, in this question about the continuity and change, there was this case of Poland and the Polish society would be something different. So there was this conscious attempt to change the narrative template, and there are changes that happen as part of process. So where would be here space for this, all factors that are beyond culture, beyond narratives, etc. I don't know, input from just biography, your personal situation. The example that you gave about those students from the immigrants from Soviet Union, they found themselves suddenly in a different situation, and they consciously chose narrative templates too, right? Probably as trying to distance themselves from the new reality of the American society they became part of.
No, that's about 10 questions. They're really very interesting and important. I think here, one of the most important issues is to distinction between the public and the private. I mean, changing what is possible to say in public doesn't necessarily change everybody's private opinion. In America, for example, we have an element today of what we call anti-racism. You can believe terrible things about black people, but you cannot say it in public and expect to be accepted, okay? If you get caught just a little bit, it's a very big problem. So the point is, it doesn't mean that if you change public discourse, that you automatically bring everybody along psychologically to follow. How it works in some cases, and I think in Germany it has come close to working from when I talk to young Germans. By the way, the case here is not that you, I think it's a mistake on my part to say you simply threw away an old narrative and now you brought in a completely new one. The new one is largely an anti-narrative of what went before. I mean, there's a lot of saying it wasn't that, it is this. But it's an ongoing process. It's very complicated. But how you negotiate the public-private is very important, because in the Soviet Union, basically everybody had to know the official narrative about all kinds of things. But at least among many of the people I knew, and they tended to be people who hung out around universities, I have a discussion sometimes with them about asking me about something that I had read, had other alternative means for finding out about an event that happened in the United States. And I would go to their home and they'd ask me, Jim, did this really happen? In our newspapers it said that there was this guy who emigrated and then decided to come back and live in Ukraine. I said, no, that happened. I read about it in the New York Times. And they looked at me and said, no, it couldn't happen. I said, how do you know? They said, because it's in the newspaper. So the point is the total, the ability to live this double-voiced or double consciousness, a very powerful divide between the public and private. In that kind of setting, the opportunities for transforming the individual are much different than when there's a looser barrier. The answer is, I don't know, but I think the best we can do is look at some cases where we come closer to having a genuine transformation, and others where it's imposed and just doesn't work over decades, and find out what are the processes that do this. I mean, you're asking me something. I'm out of my depth at this point because it's very complicated.
Organizers have signaled that I should try to stop discussion, but please, yeah, who wants just to ask or comment? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Look, organizers prepared a very nice series of events. After very, I would say, tasty presentation, they prepared tasty lunch. So, okay, but please ask question.
Okay, thank you. I'm somehow coming to the basics of your presentation. I would like to come to this distinction, evidence and narrative, which you put at the end, but which was from the very beginning all the time present there. So, and you had some distance to the word experience on one hand. On the other, you want to keep this ethical approach. So there is a kind of in this model, let's say, semiotic, semantic model, there is a problem with reality, and it leads to a kind of vicious circle at some points. And this is the very point when you say historians keep the evidence more or less like this, and the memory produces narratives. But what is the evidence, what is experience, what is evidence, it's meaningless. And if it becomes meaningful, then it gets trapped into narrative, let's say it like this. And sometimes you say we have to, or historians have to, or memory scholars, or whoever, community members, let's say, have to produce narratives. There is no way out of it. If we are rational, distanced, we can produce better narratives. And sometimes you say, if we are ethical, we produce. So this would be, the latter would be more into Rorty approach, pragmatic. And let's forget or put aside the truth, and let's take care about ethics, and let's produce narratives that make our life better. And there, it seems, in your presentation, it seems like one goes together with the other, but there might be a strong opposition between the two. So it might be that you have to decide whether to be ethical and leave true aside, or keep to true and stop being ethical in this community creative sense, something like that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, huge, big problems there, of course. I think when I say there's an ethical reason for wanting to maintain the distinction between history and memory, is because if we say that anybody has a right to any memory they want in any community, and there's no criteria for separating it out, we said that then we don't. That's what historians are in the business of trying to do, I would say, and we need that rational side. In a sense, all of this is about, it's not about memory or truth or history or truth, it's about procedure. What counts as the procedures that we want to agree upon when trying to decide these things. And we will never arrive at total final truth of anything. But in that sense, I'm not a very good Habermasian, but it sounds like we need to have procedures for rational discourse. What we find, that's separate. But I would still say it's possible to have procedures for discourse about memory, which would make memory discourse look different from procedures for history. I mean, I think those two spheres will remain somewhat separate. As a Bakhtinian, it's an endless dialogue, but I don't want to end up in a place of saying anybody has equal rights to the truth, because I think even for narrative truth, we have responsibility looking at all the evidence and saying why this evidence does not refute the narrative truths which I hold so dear. And so it's engaged dialogue, but on rational procedural basis.
So, Professor Wertsch, thank you very much for your presentation, for your readiness just to discuss with us. And now I invite you for lunch. It is on my right hand, but on your left hand, of yours left hand, yeah, in this room. Thank you.